Dr. Eric Sands joins me to discuss his book, American Public Philosophy and the Mystery of Lincolnism. No one in American political history has ever articulated a more coherent and just political philosophy than Abraham Lincoln. The mystery is that no Republican since Lincoln has been able to articulate a political philosophy nearly as coherent, with the exception of Ronald Reagan to a lesser degree. Dr. Sands discusses what encompasses a political public philosophy and what Lincoln's political philosophy included that has never been carried forth by a Republican since Abraham Lincoln's murder on April the 14th, 1865. Join us for this conversation. Dr. Eric Sands, who's the Associate Professor of Political Science and the Department Chair of Political Science and International Affairs at Berry College. And Dr. Sands is one of the fine and distinguished honored visiting graduate faculty of Ashland University's Mag program, which I had the pleasure of having him for the American founding just a few months ago, and it was an outstanding class. I want to welcome you to our program today.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
And we're going to discuss a real gem today, and that is this book that he wrote, and it's called American Public Philosophy and the Mystery of Lincolnism. And what's so very vital about this book is that we created this organization in January of 2017 to maintain the Republican Party's connection to the Declaration of Independence, to the Constitution, to its initial principles, and its greatest champion, of course, being Abraham Lincoln. This book tells us a lot of why that disconnect has occurred between the Republican Party of today and the initial Republican Party led by its first president, Abraham Lincoln. So to begin with, Doctor, what is the definition of public philosophy or political philosophy?
Yeah, that part is, for obvious reasons, very hard to define. Public philosophy is used by a wide number of scholars and writers. None of them quite mean the same thing. For some, it's the equivalent of ideology. I decided ideology was too narrow. Public philosophies are broader and more encompassing. They involve things that everybody in some way adheres to. But instead of going for a definition that was going to always find people to detract, I came up with these elements of a public philosophy. How do you know when you have a public philosophy? And so they have these elements of a kind of grounding, a narrative, a sentiment, and a lesson from experience. Right? So this grounding component is a philosophical or could be theological foundation that comes from first principles about the character of the world or of social existence. Now, that's a overly wordy way of saying you're looking for something that gives you orientation towards the wider world around you. And the grounding that is most familiar with people, especially in the founding when we were taking that, is nature. That America really originated as a natural rights republic. So that one was pretty easy, and I don't think all that confrontational to say, nature's playing a really big element here. The narrative piece is the one that I think interested me the most of the different aspects. This narrative is kind of an account of things that takes place inside of time. It has a beginning, certainly a discernible beginning, a discernible middle, and in some cases, as will be the case with the Democratic Party and when we get to progressivism, an anticipated end, some place that everything is tending and we expect to end up. And that's obviously very true of the progressives, these almost utopian visions of society that we're stemming towards. The sentiment is there mainly to capture the fact that not all politics is cerebral. Right? Politics tends to be, in many respects, about passion, about emotion. And so, what I was interested in trying to capture in a public philosophy is what is the kind of shared feeling or emotion that validates what is, considered right or good. Right? And what kind of emotion is best going to support the other parts of a public philosophy. And then finally, this lesson from experience, this simply refers to interpretations of a major event or state of affairs and helps to resolve objectively some very fundamental questions that we have. Now, that's as far as I'll take it because we can really get deep in the weeds if we push it much further. But I do want to say it's not my contention that you have to have all four pieces to have a public philosophy. It is entirely possible that you could have only two and still have a dominant public philosophy. Um, One is probably going a little thin on the possibility of that taking hold. But just because you don't see a sentiment in there or you don't see a lesson from experience doesn't mean that the other aspects are somehow faulty or not capable of providing us with the ideas that we need.
With the grounding, the foundations or groundings of the political philosophy, you also list the political elements that are included, which meaning A would be the ends of society, the bond that constitutes the American people. Secondly, the roles of government and civil society. Thirdly, D, the allocation of political authority, the role of the Constitution and constitutionalism as subheadings, the relationship between the levels of government, the arrangement of the institutions, and the principle of who should rule. And then lastly, America's role in the world. Now, if you could, Doctor, it would seem like Lincoln hit on all four of those foundations or those groundings. Could you give us just a brief summary of those four: nature, narrative, and sentiment, as well as lessons from experience that Lincoln was able to articulate?
Yeah. Well, realize I think this is important. When I went into this project, I didn't know at that point whether Lincoln had a public philosophy.
Mhm.
I mean, he's only in office for 4 years. And most of the writings that he does are not purely philosophical, where you would go and say, okay, this is what he clearly believes. So I was completely open to studying Lincoln and finding out that he didn't have a public philosophy and then trying to trace what happened to a public philosophy from there. But as I went through, it became pretty clear Lincoln had one.
Mhm.
Um, his grounding is with the founders held in nature
Mhm.
and in the natural rights tradition,
Mhm.
and in that tradition as articulated by the founders. I don't think Lincoln really alters the way that he makes an appeal to nature overall. His narrative, I think, is best expressed in the second inaugural address.
Mhm.
It's the hand of divine providence,
Yes.
this mysterious force that guides human affairs from the Almighty. And that's kind of a late addition to
Mhm.
his public philosophy. I didn't really see a lot of evidence for a narrative before getting to the second inaugural. And him defining the war in these religious terms. The sentiment, Lincoln, you could also point to the second inaugural on this one, trying to cultivate the sense of fraternity and brotherhood towards the end of the nation and the Union. So malice towards none, charity to all of that inclusive language that he uses in the second inaugural address.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is to build a kind of sentiment, especially because I think Lincoln knew, he had to have known, that the dominant sentiment at the end of the Civil War was going to be calls for punishment and justice.
Mhm.
And, justice is a powerful motivator. It's a powerful force. But Lincoln was savvy enough and wise enough to realize that if we start going after all of these Confederate leaders and hanging them, we're going to be at this again in a very short amount of time. Um, and then finally, Lincoln's lesson from history. Here, I think you've got the importance of founding, right, and how founders do their job. Because, in my view, Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address engages in a kind of second founding of the American Republic. I think he grounds that founding on principles that are almost identical to the founders, but he articulates it in a new way. Something that doesn't make it as susceptible to attacks that John Calhoun made, and others as well. And then finally, this need for a political religion as a narrative as well. Here you go back to the Lyceum Address.
Yes.
All right. And, Lincoln saying that the emotion, the feeling of the revolution has helped sustain us for a number of generations, but those passions are fading. And we're going to need something else to replace them. And, what he throws out there is this idea of embracing a political religion.
And Doctor, could you describe a little bit or get into that a little bit? What do you think Lincoln really meant? Because a political religion, and he talked about logic and reason and the law, reverence for law. But yet with religion, there is some sentimentality, there is some emotion involved. So what do you think he was trying to say by saying that political religion needed to be taught the lisping child on his mother's lap, on through the seminaries and all through the universities and all throughout our education system? What do you think he meant by political religion?
Um, it's a little bit of a hard question just because Lincoln doesn't really bring up political religion after that Lyceum Address. He doesn't appeal to it again.
Right.
So you kind of have to take a whole bunch of jigsaw pieces and start to, form them into what he's getting at. But for Lincoln, I think this is connected to this act of founding. How do you build on the founding of the regime? Right? Because you need people to love their country. You need people to be willing to sacrifice for their country. That's the big thing he's asking for. During the Civil War, he's asking for Northerners to put their lives on the line for the sake of the Union. And, to do that, I would suspect a lot of people, especially on the left, would be deeply suspicious of somebody promoting a political religion today, that this represents just kind of a blind patriotism. And would be a kind of brainwashing to just accept the government. I don't think that's what Lincoln was saying, though. I think he was saying, look, you can still make the young critical, you can still make them independent thinkers, but in the process, also teaching them what's good and right about the country they live in, and building a kind of love for country. So I don't think patriotism was a dirty word for Lincoln. And that's probably the best, I would say, as a word to describe what Lincoln is doing in his political is a healthy, rational, embracing patriotism.
And in the book, Doctor, you'll talk about the fact that Jeffersonian democracy is essentially lasted up until today. Even Jacksonian democracy, we see, which was essentially taken over the Republican Party. But Lincoln,
Yeah.
but the political philosophy of Lincoln clearly give us, and we've just described it as you've described, When was the demise of Lincolnism? When did it occur? When did it start?
Yeah, honestly, almost immediately. That's how quickly the undermining began of Lincoln's public philosophy. So the first factor, and I think we all have to agree, the most important factor, he's assassinated. Lincoln is never able to shepherd his public philosophy into Reconstruction and into the peace. And that's a huge blow. I mean, all these other presidents that we talk about, with public philosophies. So you mentioned Jefferson, you mentioned Jackson, FDR, and then it gets a little arguable from there. Whether Reagan was one or whether JFK was one. Um, but they all, with the exception of JFK, they all were able to, carry their message through their presidencies. And then, be able to implement public policy that reflects the values and the ideas that they hold, to institutionalize those things. And Lincoln doesn't get that opportunity. And that runs us immediately into the second problem. If the president who articulates this public philosophy isn't able to shepherd it on his own, then he needs a good disciple. I think the best example of this is Harry Truman, who Truman is greatly overlooked as a president, but he did a myriad of things and got a lot of legislation passed to institutionalize FDR's New Deal. That's what Lincoln needed, right? And instead he gets Andrew Johnson. The guy isn't even a Republican. He's he's antagonistic towards all of Lincoln's ideas. Not at first, but over the year after the assassination, he increasingly sides with the Southerners. So yeah, when Lincoln really needed that disciple, he didn't have somebody there who could pick up the mantle and carry it forward. Um, the Republican Party largely abandons Lincoln's ideas. The party is another instrument that a president can use to help bolster and implement his ideas. But the Republican Party went to the radicals, especially in those 1866 midterm elections. The radicals picked up a huge number of seats, and they effectively took Reconstruction policy away from the president. And when you kind of go on their side and try to articulate a public philosophy, things get messy in a big hurry. They're really not all on the same pages. It also brings out one other thing that I should have said. Public philosophies, for the most part, are going to be articulated by presidents. You're not likely to see a public philosophy coming out of the House of Representatives or the Senate. There's too many voices, hard to do. And then finally, we have these trends in science and philosophy. Philosophical schools like idealism, utilitarianism, historicism, and all of these things are a direct challenge at natural rights thinking. So they really need somebody out front explaining, how natural rights is still valid, how it's still the best way of approaching politics, and nobody's out there. And then, of course, the big stick to come down is Charles Darwin.
Yes.
Because he can undermine nature from within.
Exactly.
All the others are outside schools attacking natural rights.
Right.
But Darwin comes in and says, "Oh, I'm talking about nature too."
Yes.
And it's completely, and you're completely wrong in the fixed view of nature
Mhm.
that you're utilizing.
No question about it. And you do a great job, Doctor, in describing that influence of Darwinism on the failures or of the Republican Party to maintain Lincolnism. Also, you go to links in the book that make it clearly evident that the radical Republicans probably were more detrimental to Lincolnism than most people realize. And one of those reasons was because they didn't listen to his admonishment to be conciliatory, to malice towards none, charity to all. They took a very vengeful approach, which really significantly destroyed Lincolnism from the very beginning. Correct?
Yes. So, a couple things I'd say there. The radicals, I think, never went as far as the most radical among them wanted to. When you've got Thaddeus Stevens and you've got Charles Sumner and you've got people who want to seize Southern land and redistribute it to the slaves.
Right.
And of course, actually trying the leaders of the Confederacy and hanging them for their participation in the rebellion. Interestingly, the radicals never did that. They never went that far. They never did that much.
Mhm.
Um, and it is also worth saying that I'm not sure that Lincoln necessarily would have pursued the more lenient policy that he was articulating in 1865, because by the end of 1866, it is super clear that the South is in full reaction to what the government is doing
Mhm.
and is looking to undermine Reconstruction policy wherever they can. So my view is I think even Lincoln would have had to tighten down the screws and adopt a more aggressive Reconstruction policy. But that doesn't change what you're saying. It's right. The radicals just took things so much further than I think Lincoln ever would. That it made the battle between Reconstruction and Restoration. Um, I think inevitably, Reconstruction ran out of wind,
Mhm.
and Restoration is what finally ended up happening, and without necessarily the Southern public philosophy repudiated.
Mhm.
Right? So a lot of those same values that got the South into the war, are still cycling down in the South. Think about all those Southern authors that are writing after the Civil War. That's not the way it's supposed to work. I mean,
Right.
it's the victor that gets to write the history, and instead
Correct.
you've got these Southern writers,
Yes.
saying, "Oh, it's a lost cause. It's
Mhm.
about states' rights
Mhm.
and all about the oppression of the national government." Yeah, it means they can hold on to some of these ideas longer than they should have been able to.
Mhm. Yeah, you make a great point in the book on that. The South basically controlled the entire narrative of Reconstruction up until really James McPherson and some of the other authors that you mentioned in the book. But also, Doctor, you bring out in the book the fact that after Johnson escapes impeachment, 1868, the other great American hero, the great hero of the North, the great hero of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant, becomes president with high expectations. And immediately you show in the book that he's crippled by corruption, not specifically from him, but from his administration, which severely cripples Reconstruction.
Yeah, Grant could have been a major force in Reconstruction policy, given his stature. And everybody loved Grant. Well, not in the South, but
Right.
everybody else loved Grant.
Mhm.
But you're right. He makes a repeated mistake of appointing, his good old boys
Mhm.
to these positions of power, and they end up betraying him and get involved in all kinds of different corruption schemes. And this really does undermine his credibility quite significantly. Um, One thing we have to give him credit for was basically destroying the Ku Klux Klan in the
Mhm.
South.
Yes.
You know, the Congress passes legislation that says take the army down there and make this go away. And Grant does it, and he prosecutes that with the same fervor that he did hunting down Lee
Mhm.
during the war. And so I think that's something that we sometimes lose sight of amidst the corruption and the spoils and all that kind of stuff. But you also have in Grant a much weakened view of presidential leadership.
Mhm.
In fact, I would argue Grant really didn't have a view on presidential leadership. I mean, he says in his first inaugural address, I mean, the whole thing's like 3 or 4 sentences,
Mhm.
that I see it as my duty to carry out the will of Congress, and that's what I'm going to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No programmatic agenda, nothing about Reconstruction. Yeah,
Right.
I'm just going to follow in line with what Congress wants.
Yeah, Grant didn't build a political philosophy in that regard. You also
No, not at all.
And you also make an interesting point, Doctor, in the book that if Lincoln had remained alive, you think that he would have taken the approach to enforce the 14th and the 15th Amendments more than that was really wasn't they weren't enforced, giving equal rights and citizenship, of course, to the freed slaves, and then the right of suffrage in the 15th Amendment. That you think that Lincoln would have enforced those to a greater degree and still remaining moderate, a moderate republic.
Yes, I don't think there's any question that Lincoln would have supported those things. The 14th Amendment doesn't contain, anything I can look at that Lincoln would have had objection to, and certainly the same with the 15th Amendment. The big problem with both of those is that they didn't have vigorous enforcement. And I think Lincoln would have provided that, along with supporting the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, along with supporting the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and with supporting the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. So I think all of those things would have gone much further than we did in terms of protecting the freedmen's rights.
And also, Doctor, in the book, you use the term foundationalism. What is foundationalism?
So that's going to be related a bit to the concept of a grounding, but it's an offshoot of that. We as human beings in politics need to have something under our feet
Mm-hmm.
to help orient us. Otherwise the political world is utter chaos.
Yep.
And so one of the things that these public philosophy presidents do is they mold a common foundation from which we can debate, we can make decisions, we can shape the political landscape. And so, these folks don't come around often. They're pretty rare, but where the existing foundation is no longer able to articulate the problems and the issues that we confront, that's where a president would engage in foundationalism and put that common floor for us all to walk on.
And in the book, Doctor, you clearly describe the some of the successes and the failures of the radical Republicans and the moderate Republicans with the Freedmen's Bureau and some of the acts that the Congress had taken in Reconstruction efforts. But you also get into the Democrats, and you talk about the peace Democrats and the war Democrats, and the McClellan campaign in 1864, and what they were trying to hold on to. The Democrats who were remaining loyal to the Union, of course, is what General McClellan was, and several of course, Andrew Johnson. That's specifically why he was chosen to the ticket, because he remained a Unionist from Tennessee. But you also go into great length to describe for us the differences in the Democratic Party as well at that.
Yeah, I mean, just because the Democrats are an example of a losing public philosophy doesn't mean that it's still not important. It is a viable alternative to Lincolnism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought it was important to recognize, what that public philosophy among Democrats, um, sort of oriented them to. And clearly, the big the big issue is between those that support the peace and those who support the war, and that creates a huge fissure in the Democratic Party. Um, the Peace Democrats are also an interesting story. They show how hard it is in American politics to be a loyal opposition. Right? And nowhere is this more difficult than in a war. Right? How do you say that you don't think we should be in the war? How do you say that we don't think we should be funding a war? And at the same time not be labeled as traitors. Right? And I'll tell you now, the peace Democrats never quite figured that out, and maybe that's just inevitable. And certainly the same kind of thing happened in World War II and World War One, but it's most acute here because the war is taking place here. So it's touching people in a very immediate and tangible way. And they did. They tried to draw a line in the sand and say, look, we're not crossing over that. We're not hoping for a Union loss. We're just saying we don't agree with the war, and if it was up to us, we'd negotiate terms of surrender. And of course, when they do that, especially among the more radical of the radical Republicans, in the newspapers, they'd be branded with the accusation of treason.
Doctor, I also thought it was very interesting that you make the correlation between at the heart of the Republican Party exists Puritanism, coming back from the very founding in Plymouth Rock and the influence of the Puritans, not necessarily looked at in a good light amongst the Democrats or amongst maybe some of the other people during this time in the middle of the 1860s. Could you just touch on that briefly, on the influences of Puritanism on the Republican Party?
Yeah, the Republicans carry with them vestiges of the Whig Party, and the Whigs had very clear tentacles, going back to the Puritan era. The Whigs carried with them moral appeals and values appeals. So they'd campaign a lot of times on issues like law and order, and social caution and moral restraint. And so it wasn't uncommon to see Whigs involved in various moral causes like temperance, public education, Sunday closing laws. And so when the Whig Party dissolves and the Republican Party ends up taking in significant numbers of Whigs, they're taking on those moral positions as well. And so to the extent that that kind of moralism, goes all the way back to the Puritans, it's now infused the Republican Party with it as a corollary.
In your estimation, Doctor, do you think there's been any preceding or any presidents that have preceded Lincoln that have been able to come close to articulating the political philosophy as well as he did in his example and in his word?
Maybe Jefferson. Jackson, is his public philosophy is sort of attributed to him based on intellectuals that he associated with, like George Bancroft, one of the leading historians of the 19th century. He was somebody that Jackson thought highly of, and so we can bring in those ideas. The only one that really stands out to me, though, as making a systematic effort at trying to create a public philosophy is FDR.
Yep.
There's a lot in his speeches,
Yes.
where He's appealing to the Declaration of Independence. He's rewording the Declaration of Independence. He's trying to introduce history as a grounding instead of nature. And a lot of that stuff had precursors in the progressive era. So
Yeah.
you can look through the progressives to see, the areas where they disagree with Lincoln as well.
And would it be safe to say that maybe Reagan would come the closest to the Republicans in trying to articulate in his estimation, would be the conservative, really a reaction against the New Deal and against FDR's overgrowth of the federal government? Reagan comes along and said the government is the problem. Do you think that Reagan was the last Republican to try to articulate a political philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, the Republican public philosophy, I think, emerged, around 1964 with the
Well,
nomination of Barry Goldwater.
right.
You had all of those disparate conservative social movements that all coalesce and in the convention. And so I think what happens is, you get about a 20-year period where these different ideas begin to merge together into something coherent as a whole. And then it took Reagan to be able to interpret those ideas to the people and to give them a mouthpiece. And I don't want to make Reagan sound like he was just a puppet. He had his own mind, and he certainly thought very deeply about a lot of these issues. I think you could make a case for Reagan. As I said, I mean, you could sort of make a case for JFK as well.
Yeah.
But these folks don't come along very often.
No, and Doctor, for the first time in the history of the Republican Party platform this year, the Declaration of Independence wasn't even mentioned in what I call Trump's platform. So right away, the idea of nature is completely eviscerated from the Republican Party from the beginning, and we're as far away from a political theory or political philosophy now. The Republican Party is further away from political philosophy now than I think it's ever been.
I think that's probably true.
Appreciate your book, Doctor, because as constitutional Republicans, we want to maintain that electric cord back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the initial principles that founded the Republican Party, which were based on moral good, wanting to see the expansion of slavery stopped in the territories, and also to maintain the connection to Lincoln, who articulated the greatest Republican political philosophy. And that's why we want you to encourage constitutional Republicans to get out and get this book, and we will be providing a link to it. Dr. Sands, I hope you'll come back and join us to talk about your compilation on political parties that you've put together for teaching American history. I hope we can have a discussion on that, because that's a fascinating topic as well.
I'd be glad to.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time with another Constitutional Republicans Academia presentation. Thank you.